Duetze Corduba sunrise, a glimpse of time's passage. Picture this. It's dawn in ancient Corduba, and the first light is catching the terracotta tiles of a modest villa. Steam rises from a cup of warm wine mixed with honey. A young boy sits cross-legged on a stone bench, watching his father prepare for another day of business along the Guadalquivir River. This is how Lucius Annaeus Seneca began most of his childhood mornings, in quiet observation. Even then, something about him was different. While other children ran through the olive groves or played with wooden toys, young Seneca seemed drawn to the spaces between moments. The pause before his mother spoke, the silence after his father finished reading, the way shadows moved across the courtyard walls as time itself shifted around them. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're a child and you suddenly become aware that this moment, this exact breath you're taking, will never come again. Most of us learn to ignore that awareness. We have to. It would be too overwhelming to carry that consciousness through every ordinary Tuesday, every routine conversation, every mundane task. But Seneca never quite learned to ignore it. His father, Seneca the Elder, was a man of words and rhetoric. Their home in Cordoba was filled with the sound of practiced speeches, philosophical debates that stretched into the evening hours, and the constant scratch of stylus on wax tablet. This wasn't unusual for a family of their standing, but the intensity was remarkable, even by Roman standards. Picture young Seneca, maybe 8 or 9 years old, curled up in the corner while his father hosted gatherings of local intellectuals. These men would argue about justice, about virtue, about the proper way to live. And while they debated grand concepts, the boy was learning something else entirely. He was learning to watch time move. Have you ever noticed how differently time behaves when you're truly paying attention? How a single conversation can feel like it lasts hours, while entire afternoons can slip away without a trace? Seneca was discovering this as a child. In those quiet moments between his father's dramatic declarations, in the spaces where grown-ups paused to think, that's where young Seneca lived. Cordoba itself was teaching him about time's strange nature. The city sat along the great river, and like all river towns, it understood rhythm. The daily flow of merchants and goods, the seasonal flooding that brought rich soil to the surrounding farms, the way generations of families had built their lives around these predictable cycles. But Cordoba was also a place caught between worlds, Roman enough to matter in the empire's grand scheme, yet still Spanish enough to remember older ways of being, Greek philosophy mixed with local traditions. Latin literature sat alongside stories that had been told in these hills long before Rome was even a dream. For a sensitive child like Seneca, this meant growing up with a deep awareness that everything was temporary. The Roman customs his family embraced so carefully, the Greek ideas his father quoted so confidently, the local festivals his neighbors celebrated so joyfully, all of it was just one layer in time's endless accumulation. Most mornings, after the household had settled into its routines, Seneca would slip away to his favorite spot, a small garden behind their villa where his mother grew herbs for cooking and healing. There was a bench there, positioned to catch the morning light, and from it you could see both the river and the hills beyond the city. He would sit there with a wax tablet, not to write lessons or copy rhetoric like his father expected, but to try to capture something else. The way light changed on the water, the sound of his mother humming while she worked, the feeling of being completely present in a moment that was already slipping away. These weren't the exercises of a future philosopher, exactly. They were more like the instinctive practices of a child who somehow understood that attention itself was precious, that the act of truly seeing, truly listening, truly being present, this was perhaps the most important skill anyone could develop. His mother, Helvia, recognized this quality in her son. While Seneca the Elder focused on preparing the boy for public life in Rome, Helvia quietly nurtured this contemplative side of his nature. She would join him sometimes in the herb garden, not to teach him about plants, but simply to share the experience of watching time move. "Notice how the shadows change," she might say softly. "Even while we're sitting still, everything is moving. Everything is becoming something else." It was Helvia who first introduced Seneca to the idea that time wasn't just something that happened to you. It was something you could choose to be conscious of, something you could honor by paying attention, something that became more valuable, not less, when you acknowledged how quickly it passed. This lesson would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time Seneca reached adolescence, his father had made the decision that would change everything. The family would move to Rome. The boy's obvious intellectual gifts needed proper cultivation, and Cordoba, for all its charms, was still provincial compared to the empire's beating heart. But before they left, Seneca spent one final morning in his mother's garden. He was older now, maybe 15, and already showing signs of the respiratory illness that would plague him throughout his life. The early morning air was easier for him to breathe, and the quiet helped settle his often anxious mind. He sat on his familiar bench, looking out over the river one last time, and tried to memorize everything. Not just the visual details, but the feeling of being rooted in this particular place, at this particular moment in his young life. The weight of the stone beneath him, the sound of water moving over rocks, the way his mother's voice carried from inside the house as she directed the servants in their packing. This was his first conscious experience of what he would later call the eternal present. That strange phenomenon where you become so fully aware of a moment that it seems to expand beyond normal time, where past and future fade away, and there's only this, only now. Only the pure experience of being alive and awake. He couldn't have articulated it then, of course. He was just a teenager saying goodbye to his childhood home, but something in that final morning stayed with him. Something about the preciousness of ordinary moments, the way attention could transform even simple experiences into something sacred. Years later, when he was writing letters to friends about how to live well, how to use time wisely, how to find peace in a chaotic world, he would often think back to those mornings in Cordoba, to his mother's gentle presence in the herb garden, to the way shadows moved across familiar walls, to the sound of the river that had flowed through his childhood and would continue flowing long after he was gone. Rome was waiting, with all its opportunities and dangers, its philosophical schools and political intrigues, its promise of fame and its threat of destruction. Seneca would become many things in that great city: student, teacher, advisor to emperors, one of the wealthiest men in the empire, and ultimately a voice of wisdom that would echo across centuries. But first, he was just a young man leaving home, carrying with him the most important lesson his childhood had taught him. That time is not something we have, but something we are. That each moment offers a choice: to be present or absent, to pay attention or drift away, to honor the gift of consciousness or take it for granted. The ship that carried the family from Cordoba to Rome also carried this quiet understanding that everything we love is temporary, and that this temporariness, rather than making life meaningless, is exactly what makes it precious. As the Spanish coastline faded behind them and the vast Mediterranean opened ahead, Seneca stood at the ship's rail, practicing what would become his life's work: the art of being fully present while everything around him changed, the art of holding lightly to what matters most, the art of finding peace in the midst of time's relentless passage. This is where our story truly begins. Not with grand pronouncements or dramatic events, but with a young man learning to breathe consciously, to see clearly, and to understand that wisdom begins with the simple recognition that this moment, right now, is all we ever really have. The Roman Library, seeking wisdom in scrolls. The great library of Rome rose before him like a temple to human thought itself. Seneca paused at its threshold, breathing in the scent of papyrus and cedar oil. The quiet rustle of scrolls being unfurled, the soft murmur of scholars lost in contemplation. Here, in this sanctuary of wisdom, he would spend countless hours learning not just what to think, but how to think. The morning light filtered through high windows, casting golden rectangles across the marble floor. Seneca moved slowly through the vast hall, his footsteps echoing softly in the reverent silence. Shelves stretched toward the ceiling, filled with the accumulated knowledge of centuries, the thoughts of philosophers who had grappled with the same questions that kept him awake at night. How do we live well? How do we find peace in uncertainty? How do we love without losing ourselves to attachment? He pulled a scroll from its place. Heraclitus, the philosopher of change. The papyrus was smooth beneath his fingers, worn soft by countless other seekers who had come before him. "No man ever steps in the same river twice," he read, the words seeming to shimmer in the filtered light. "For it's not the same river, and he's not the same man." Seneca closed his eyes, letting the wisdom settle into his bones. This was what he had come to understand in those quiet moments in his mother's garden, that everything flows, everything changes, everything passes. The art was not in stopping the flow, but in learning to move with it gracefully. He found his usual corner, a small alcove with a wooden table worn smooth by generations of students. Here, surrounded by the gentle sounds of learning, the soft scratch of stylus on wax tablet, the whispered conversations of fellow seekers, he could lose himself in the pursuit of understanding. Today he reached for Epicurus. Tomorrow, perhaps Aristotle. Each philosopher offered a different lens through which to examine life's great questions. Some spoke of virtue as the highest good, others of pleasure, still others of duty or wisdom or love. Seneca learned to hold these different perspectives lightly, like his mother held her herbs, appreciating their unique properties without clinging too tightly to any single remedy. The hours passed unnoticed. Outside, Rome bustled with its endless urgency. Merchants hawking their wares, politicians making their pronouncements, citizens rushing from one obligation to the next. But here, in this quiet sanctuary, time moved differently. Here the ancient conversations continued. Plato still dialogued with his students. Zeno still walked his painted porch, and young minds still wrestled with eternal questions. Seneca unrolled another scroll, this one containing letters from Epicurus to his friend Menocius. The personal nature of the writing drew him in. These weren't abstract treatises, but intimate conversations about how to live. "Do not spoil what you have by desiring what you have not," he read, "but remember that what you now have was once among the things you only hoped for." The words landed in his heart like seeds in fertile soil. How often he had fallen into that trap, focusing on what was missing rather than appreciating what was present. Even here, surrounded by more wisdom than he could absorb in a lifetime, he sometimes caught his mind wandering to other scrolls, other authors, other insights just out of reach. He set down the scroll and simply breathed, the way his mother had taught him in the garden. The library came back into focus, the play of light and shadow on ancient stone, the quiet dedication of fellow students, the profound privilege of having access to humanity's greatest thoughts. This moment right here was enough, more than enough. An elderly scholar at a nearby table looked up from his reading and smiled. They had never spoken, but they shared something deeper than words, a mutual recognition of what it meant to be a seeker. The old man's eyes were bright with curiosity despite his age, and Seneca saw in them a reflection of his own hunger for understanding. This was another gift of the library, the silent community of learners, each person pursuing their own questions, yet somehow connected in the shared quest for wisdom. Some came seeking practical knowledge, how to manage estates or navigate politics. Others, like Seneca, came seeking something more elusive, how to live with grace, how to face uncertainty with courage, how to love without attachment. He reached for another scroll, this one containing fragments of Heraclitus's teachings. "The way up and down are one and the same," he read. "God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, surfeit and hunger." The paradoxes delighted him, the way they forced his mind to stretch beyond its usual patterns of thinking. Perhaps this was the real education, not the accumulation of facts or the memorization of arguments, but the gradual expansion of his capacity to hold complexity, to see that apparent opposites might actually be part of a larger unity, to understand that wisdom often lived in the spaces between certainties. The afternoon light shifted, casting new patterns on the floor. Seneca noticed how the library itself embodied the philosophical principles he was studying. It was both permanent and constantly changing. The building endured while new scrolls arrived and old ones crumbled. New students replaced those who had completed their studies. Yet something essential remained constant. He thought of his mother's garden again, how she had tended it with such care while accepting that each season brought its own cycle of growth and decay. The library was like that garden, a place where wisdom was cultivated with patience and attention, where the seeds of understanding were planted in young minds and tended with the devotion of generations. As the day wore on, Seneca found himself moving more slowly, reading with deeper attention rather than trying to cover more ground. This, too, was a lesson the library taught, that wisdom wasn't about consuming as much information as possible, but about allowing what he read to truly penetrate, to change him from the inside out. The scroll in his hands contained a letter from Epicurus about friendship. "Friendship dances around the world," the ancient philosopher wrote, proclaiming to all of us that we must wake up to the recognition of happiness. Seneca smiled, thinking of the friendships he was forming here, not just with his fellow students, but with the great minds of the past who spoke to him across the centuries through their preserved words. As evening approached and the light began to fade, Seneca carefully rolled up the scroll he had been reading. Tomorrow he would return, and the day after that, and for as many days as it took to absorb what these great teachers had to offer. But he was beginning to understand that the real wisdom wasn't contained in any single text. It was emerging in the quiet spaces between his reading, in the moments when he paused to breathe and reflect, in the gradual transformation of his own heart and mind. The library had become his second home, a place where time moved at the pace of understanding rather than urgency, where the questions mattered more than the answers, and where a young man from Corduba could sit in conversation with the wisest souls who had ever lived. Writing by Candlelight, Reflections on Mortality. Years passed in that sacred library, and eventually Seneca began to write. Not proclamations or grand treatises, but quiet letters to friends, personal reflections that captured the wisdom he was slowly gathering like dewdrops in the early morning light. He would write by candlelight in his small room, the flame casting dancing shadows on the walls as his stylus moved across the wax tablets. Then later, when the words felt ready, onto precious papyrus. There was something about the candlelight that made the writing feel more honest, more intimate, as if the flickering flame was keeping watch over his most vulnerable thoughts. "It is not that we have a short time to live," he wrote one evening, the candle burning low beside him, "but that we waste a lot of it, The words emerged from years of watching, years of seeing how people moved through their days as if time were an endless river, never noticing how quickly the water was flowing past their feet. In the library, surrounded by the works of those who had lived and died centuries before, he had begun to understand something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We are all going to die. Not someday. Not in some distant, abstract future, but inevitably, certainly, perhaps sooner than we imagine. The Romans had a phrase for this remembering, memento mori. Remember that you must die. But Seneca was discovering that this wasn't meant to frighten or paralyze. It was meant to wake us up. He thought of his mother's garden in Cordoba, how she would tend each plant with such careful attention, knowing that the growing season was brief and precious. She didn't mourn the coming winter while planting her seeds in spring. Instead, she poured her love into each moment of growth, each day of tending, each small harvest. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he wrote, remembering a line from the poet Seneca had encountered in his reading. The candle flickered, and he paused to trim the wick, watching how the flame steadied and brightened with this small act of care. This was what he was learning about time, about mortality, about the strange gift of being human. We are like candles, burning brightly for a brief span, and the knowledge of our burning makes each moment more precious, not less. He had watched wealthy Romans accumulate vast fortunes, as if gold could purchase immortality. He had seen politicians grasping for power, as if controlling others could somehow give them control over their own fate. He had observed scholars hoarding knowledge like treasure, as if information could build walls against the inevitable. But here in the candlelight, writing these simple truths, Seneca was finding a different way to live with the reality of death. Not denial, not desperate accumulation, but a gentle awakening to the beauty of what is temporary. Life is long enough if you know how to use it, he wrote, his stylus moving slowly across the tablet. The candle had burned down to a small pool of wax, but still gave enough light for these essential words. He thought about the people he had met in Rome, so many of them living as if they were already dead, going through the motions of days without ever really arriving in their own lives. They complained about not having enough time, while spending hours in meaningless conversations, days in pursuits that brought them no joy, years in relationships that drained rather than nourished their souls. But what if the shortness of life wasn't a tragedy but a gift? What if knowing that our time was limited could teach us to choose more carefully, to love more deeply, to pay attention to the small miracles that surrounded us each day? The candle sputtered, and Seneca realized he had been writing for hours. Outside his window, the city was settling into sleep, the sounds of evening commerce giving way to the quieter rhythms of night. He set down his stylus and rubbed his tired eyes, but his heart felt strangely light. This was what he wanted to share, not as a teacher lecturing from some distant authority, but as a friend writing by candlelight, someone who had also struggled with the weight of mortality and found in that struggle a path to greater aliveness. It is not the man who has too little, he continued writing, but the man who craves more, who is poor. The insight felt personal, born from his own observations of Roman society, his own temptations toward acquisition and status. He had seen how the fear of death often drove people to grasp at everything, to try to fill the space of their mortality with possessions, achievements, external validation. But sitting here in the simple light of a single candle, writing words that might outlive his physical body, he was discovering a different kind of wealth, the wealth of presence, of attention, of time consciously lived rather than unconsciously spent. He remembered an afternoon in the library when he had been reading Epicurus and had come across the idea that philosophy was medicine for the soul. At first, it had seemed like a metaphor, but now, writing by candlelight about mortality and time, he understood it more literally. These weren't just intellectual exercises. These were practices for living, ways of thinking and being that could actually heal the anxiety, the rushing, the constant sense of not enoughness that seemed to plague so many people. The candle was nearly finished now, just a small flame dancing in a pool of melted wax. Soon he would need to light another, or perhaps simply sit in the darkness for a while, letting these thoughts settle into his bones. "Let us examine ourselves," he wrote in what he sensed would be his final lines for the evening, "and rid ourselves of the faults we have acquired, for we can heal ourselves." This was the gift of remembering mortality. It stripped away the non-essential, revealed what truly mattered, and invited a kind of gentle urgency that was different from the frantic rushing he saw in the streets of Rome. It was the urgency of love, the urgency of presence, the urgency of not postponing the life you were meant to live until some imaginary future when conditions might be more perfect. The candle flickered one final time and went out. Seneca sat in the darkness for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the weight of the silence around him. Tomorrow there would be another candle, another opportunity to write, another day to practice this art of conscious living. But tonight was complete, whole in itself, a small lifetime contained within the span of a single flame. And that, he realized, was enough. In the darkness he could hear his own breathing, steady and calm, marking time not with anxiety about what was ending, but with gratitude for what had been given. Another day of being alive, another evening of reflection, another opportunity to transform philosophy into the lived experience of wisdom. The city slept around him, but Seneca remained awake a little longer, sitting with these thoughts about mortality and time, letting them become not just ideas he had written about, but truths he was learning to embody, one candlelit evening at a time. The Roman Forum, a sea of distractions. When morning came, Seneca would set aside his candle and his philosophical reflections and step into a world that moved at an entirely different pace. The quiet contemplation of his study gave way to something far more demanding, far more immediate, the relentless energy of Roman public life. The Forum Romanum stretched before him like a vast stage, where every citizen seemed to be performing multiple roles at once. Merchants called out their wares from beneath colorful awnings, their voices competing with the rhythmic hammering of craftsmen, the clip-clop of horses pulling carts loaded with goods from distant provinces, the animated discussions of lawyers preparing their cases on marble steps. It was overwhelming, this sea of human activity. Every corner held a different drama. Every colonnade echoed with urgent conversations about politics, trade, family matters, social obligations. The very air seemed to vibrate with the collective energy of thousands of people, all moving with purpose, all convinced that their particular concern was the most important thing in the world. Seneca had learned to navigate these crowds, but he had also learned to observe them. As he walked through the Forum, making his way to the Senate House or to meetings with other advisors, he couldn't help but notice how easily people became swept up in the current of immediate demands, how quickly they forgot, in the midst of all this bustling activity, the deeper questions that had occupied his thoughts just hours before. Here was a senator, red-faced with indignation, gesturing wildly as he complained about some perceived slight to his dignity. There was a merchant, frantically calculating profits, his brow furrowed with worry about a shipment that had been delayed. Everywhere Seneca looked, he saw people consumed by the urgency of the moment, their attention scattered among a dozen different concerns, their energy dispersed like water poured onto sand. It reminded him, this constant motion, this endless chatter, of something his mother had once said about her garden. She had noticed that the plants that grew wild, without tending, often grew in many directions at once. They would send out shoots here and there, reaching toward every source of light, but in doing so, they rarely grew strong. The plants she cultivated, the ones she pruned and guided, these grew with intention, with focus, and they flourished. The Forum, for all its magnificence, for all its importance as the beating heart of the empire, was like those wild plants, energy flowing in every direction, attention pulled toward every stimulus, but so little of it channeled toward what might actually matter in the long run. As his responsibilities grew, as he found himself drawn deeper into the machinery of government, Seneca felt this tension more acutely. There were always meetings to attend, documents to review, decisions to weigh. The young Emperor Nero required guidance, though he didn't always welcome it. There were senators to consult, administrators to coordinate, endless details of governance that seemed to multiply faster than they could be resolved. Each day brought its own set of urgent matters, a dispute between provinces that required diplomatic intervention, a question of tax policy that affected thousands of citizens, a ceremonial function that demanded careful planning and flawless execution, and beneath it all, the constant undercurrent of Roman politics, the delicate balance of competing interests, the need to navigate between what was expedient and what was right. It would have been easy, Seneca realized, to become completely absorbed in this whirlwind of activity, to measure his days by the number of meetings attended, the problems solved, the crises averted, to find his identity in being indispensable, in being the person others turned to when they needed answers, or influence, or simply someone to share the burden of difficult decisions. But something in him resisted this pull. Perhaps it was those early lessons in his mother's garden, the memory of learning to notice small things, to find significance in quiet moments. Perhaps it was all those hours in the library, reading the thoughts of philosophers who had grappled with similar questions centuries before. Or perhaps it was simply the habit he had developed of returning each evening to his candle and his writing, to that space where he could step back from the day's demands and ask different questions. What was all this activity really about? He wondered as he watched the crowds swirl around him. What were people actually seeking? Beneath all the buying and selling, the arguing and negotiating, the endless pursuit of advantage and status, were they finding what they were looking for, or were they simply staying busy enough to avoid asking whether what they were seeking was worth finding? He began to see the Forum differently, not just as the center of Roman civilization, but as a kind of mirror, a reflection of the human tendency to fill every moment with activity, to mistake motion for progress, to confuse being busy with being purposeful. The same patterns he observed here, he could see in his own life, in the way his days could become consumed by urgent matters that crowded out time for reflection, for genuine connection, for the kind of deep thinking that actually changed how he understood the world. There was nothing wrong, he realized, with the energy and activity of the Forum. Commerce was necessary. Governance was important. Social connections had their place. But when these things became the whole of life, when they consumed all available attention, they could become a kind of distraction from the deeper questions that gave life its meaning. Walking through the crowds, Seneca began to practice a different way of being present. Instead of being swept along by the urgency that surrounded him, he tried to maintain that quality of attention he had cultivated in his evening reflections. He listened to conversations, but he also listened for what wasn't being said. He observed the frantic energy, But he also noticed the moments of stillness, the brief pauses when someone stopped, looked up at the sky, seemed to remember something beyond the immediate demands of the day. It was like learning to swim against a current, this practice of maintaining perspective in the midst of so much distraction. The pull toward urgency was strong. The pressure to react immediately to every demand was constant, but gradually, he found he could move through the forum while remaining connected to something deeper, something that wasn't subject to the fluctuations of daily drama. The real challenge, he was beginning to understand, wasn't to escape from the world of activity and responsibility. It was to learn how to engage with it fully, while not losing sight of what was truly important, to be present to the immediate demands of life, while remaining rooted in the deeper understanding he had been cultivating through years of philosophical study and reflection. As the sun reached its peak, casting sharp shadows between the columns, Seneca would find himself looking forward to evening, to that quiet hour when he could once again light his candle, take up his pen, and return to the questions that the day's distractions had temporarily obscured but never quite erased. Olive grove and baths, finding moments of peace. The weight of the forum's demands would follow him, even as his sandals carried him away from the marble columns and urgent voices. But Seneca had learned, over these years of balancing philosophy with public duty, that the mind needed sanctuaries, places where the deeper currents of thought could flow freely, undisturbed by the endless tide of immediate concerns. Just beyond the city's edge, where the cobblestones gave way to dusty paths, lay an ancient olive grove. The trees here had stood for generations, their gnarled trunks bearing witness to countless seasons of growth and rest. Seneca found himself drawn to this quiet place, especially in the late afternoon, when the light filtered through silver-green leaves in patterns that seemed to shift with each gentle breeze. Here, among these patient trees, time moved differently, not with the urgent pulse of the forum, not with the measured precision of his evening writing, but with something closer to the rhythm he remembered from his mother's garden in Cordoba, the rhythm of growing things, of seasons turning, of life unfolding according to its own deeper wisdom. He would choose a spot beneath one of the older trees, its trunk wide enough to lean against, its shade cool and welcoming. The olive grove asked nothing of him, no decisions to make, no letters to dictate, no political calculations to weigh. Here he could simply be, and in that being, in that conscious presence to the moment, he found a different kind of understanding beginning to emerge. The leaves above rustled softly, a sound like whispered conversations in a language older than words. Seneca would close his eyes and listen, not trying to interpret or analyze, but simply allowing the sound to wash over him like water over stone. This too was philosophy, he realized. This quiet attention to the world as it revealed itself, moment by moment, breath by breath. Sometimes he would notice how the light changed as clouds passed overhead, how the temperature shifted with the breeze, how his own thoughts seemed to settle like dust after a passing cart. The olive grove became a place of return, not just to peace, but to the fundamental awareness that had first stirred in him as a young boy, watching his mother tend her herbs with such patient attention. In these moments of stillness, Seneca began to understand something that all his philosophical reading had pointed toward, but never quite captured. That wisdom wasn't something to be grasped, like a scroll to be unrolled and studied, but something to be lived, something that emerged naturally when the mind was allowed to rest in its own clarity, like water settling in a still pool. The olive trees seemed to embody this teaching. They grew slowly, patiently, responding to sun and rain and season without hurry or resistance. Their fruit came in its own time, Their branches reached toward light without strain. There was something profoundly restful in witnessing this natural unfolding, this effortless being that asked nothing more of itself than to be fully what it was. As the afternoon deepened, Seneca would sometimes walk slowly between the trees, his footsteps soft on the earth, his breathing gradually synchronizing with the gentle rhythm of wind through leaves. These walks became a form of meditation, a way of letting his body remember what his mind sometimes forgot, that he too was part of this natural order, subject to the same seasons of effort and rest, growth and reflection. When evening approached, and it was time to return to the city, Seneca would carry something of the grove's peace with him, not as an escape from his responsibilities, but as a reminder of the deeper ground from which all meaningful action arose. The olive grove had become, without his quite realizing it, another teacher, one that instructed through presence rather than words, through being rather than doing. But the grove was not his only refuge. Rome itself, for all its noise and urgency, contained spaces designed for restoration. The great baths, with their pools of varying temperatures, their halls filled with gentle steam, offered a different kind of sanctuary. Here the body could release the tensions that accumulated, like sediment, from days spent navigating the complex currents of public life. Seneca would arrive at the baths as the day's heat was beginning to fade, when the crowds had thinned and conversation moved in quieter rhythms. The ritual of bathing, he had come to understand, was itself a form of philosophy, a practice of attention to the body, to the simple pleasure of warm water, to the luxury of time spent without agenda or goal. In the tepidarium, where the water was pleasantly warm, he would settle into stillness and let his muscles gradually soften. The gentle heat seemed to dissolve not just physical tension, but the accumulated weight of decisions made, words spoken, responsibilities carried. Here too, like in the olive grove, time moved differently, moved with the patience of water, finding its level, of heat slowly penetrating, of restoration happening at its own natural pace. The sound of water, flowing and bubbling, created its own kind of music, not unlike the rustling of olive leaves, but deeper, more enveloping. Seneca would close his eyes and let this sound fill his awareness, washing away the day's fragments of conversation, the echoes of urgent voices, the mental residue of problems solved and problems postponed. Sometimes, in the caldarium where the water was hottest, he would feel his breathing deepen, his thoughts becoming as fluid as the steam that rose around him. The heat invited a kind of surrender, a letting go of the need to hold everything together through will and effort. Here he could remember, in his very bones, that rest was not weakness but wisdom, that the capacity to receive, to be nourished, to allow restoration was as essential as the capacity to act and decide and lead. Other bathers moved through the halls like gentle shadows, each absorbed in their own process of renewal. There was something beautiful, Seneca thought, in this shared silence, this communal recognition that human beings needed, deserved, these moments of pure being, that a life lived only in service to external demands, however noble those demands might be, would eventually exhaust itself. As he moved between pools, from warm to cool and back again, Seneca felt his body remembering its own intelligence, the way it naturally sought balance, the way it responded to care with renewed vitality, the way it carried wisdom that complemented but didn't depend on the mind's understanding. When he finally emerged from the baths, skin flushed and muscles relaxed, Seneca would walk slowly through the evening streets, carrying within him a sense of integration. The olive grove had taught him about natural patience, about being present to life's unfolding. The baths had reminded him of the body's need for tending, for the kind of attention that nourished rather than demanded. These sanctuaries, he realized, were not separate from his philosophical practice, but essential to it. They provided the conditions in which deeper understanding could emerge, the way plants needed both soil and rain, both roots and light. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities for service, its own invitations to bring wisdom into action. But tonight, renewed by olive shade and healing waters, he would return to his evening practice of writing, carrying with him the peace that comes, not from escaping life's demands, but from learning to meet them from a place of genuine rest. Roman garden and simple meal, contentment in simplicity, walking slowly through the narrow streets toward home. Seneca found himself drawn to pause at a small garden tucked between two modest houses. The evening light filtered through grapevines that climbed wooden trellises, casting gentle shadows across beds of herbs and vegetables that grew in careful rows. This was not the grand estate of a wealthy patrician, but something far more precious, a space where ordinary people had created beauty with their own hands. Basil released its sweet fragrance as the breeze stirred its leaves, while tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, promising the simple abundance that came from patient tending. The garden's owner, an elderly woman with soil-darkened fingers, looked up from where she knelt among the mint plants. Her face carried the contentment of someone who had learned to find joy in small things, in the daily ritual of watering and weeding, in watching seeds transform into sustenance. "The earth teaches us everything we need to know about virtue," she said simply, her voice carrying the wisdom of seasons witnessed and harvests gathered. "Give what you can. Take only what you need. Trust in the natural order of growth and rest." Seneca nodded, understanding that he was witnessing philosophy lived rather than merely discussed. Here was someone who had discovered what he was still learning to articulate, that happiness was not found in accumulating more, but in appreciating fully what was already present. The woman offered him a sprig of rosemary, its needle-like leaves releasing their sharp, cleansing scent. "For remembrance," she said with a gentle smile, unknowing that she was gifting him with exactly what his philosophical practice sought to cultivate, the art of conscious memory, of holding each moment with appropriate reverence. As twilight deepened, Seneca found himself invited to share a simple meal with this humble gardener and her family. They gathered around a wooden table worn smooth by countless such gatherings, where the day's harvest had been transformed into soup, fragrant with herbs, bread still warm from the oven, wine that spoke of sun and rain and time's patient alchemy. There was no elaborate entertainment, no costly delicacies imported from distant provinces, no servants rushing to anticipate every need. Instead, there was something infinitely more valuable: the presence of people who had learned to be genuinely present with one another. The conversation moved like a gentle stream, flowing naturally from the day's small events to observations about the changing seasons, from memories of loved ones to hopes for tomorrow's garden. No one performed or competed. No one sought to impress with clever words or important connections. Here was contentment in its purest form, not the satisfaction that comes from having acquired something new, but the deeper peace that emerges when we recognize the sufficiency of what surrounds us. The bread was enough. The simple wine was enough. The warmth of genuine companionship was more than enough. Seneca watched the lamplight play across the faces of his hosts, noting how their expressions carried a quality he rarely saw in the marble halls of power, a kind of settled satisfaction, an absence of the restless hunger that drove so many of his contemporaries to seek ever more wealth, more status, more validation from external sources. This is what the philosophers mean when they speak of virtue, he thought, observing how naturally these people practiced generosity, sharing their meal with a stranger, offering their best without calculation or expectation of return. Their goodness was not a performance or a strategy, but simply who they were when no one important was watching. The meal concluded with fruit from their own trees, pears sweet with summer's accumulated sunshine, grapes that burst with concentrated flavor on the tongue. Each bite carried the story of its growth, the patience required for trees to mature, the trust that what was planted would eventually yield its gift. As the evening drew toward its close, Seneca felt something settling in his chest, a quality of satisfaction he had not experienced at the most elaborate banquets of Rome's elite. This was what sufficiency felt like, not the absence of desire, but the presence of deep appreciation for what was already here. The family's youngest child had fallen asleep against her grandmother's shoulder, her face peaceful in the lamplight, embodying the trust that comes from knowing oneself, held by love that asks nothing in return. This too was philosophy, this simple acceptance of care freely given. Walking home through streets now quiet with night, Seneca carried with him the taste of that honest meal, the memory of faces lit by contentment rather than ambition, the understanding that virtue was not something to be achieved, but something to be lived, one simple choice at a time. Tomorrow would bring its complexities, its demands for wisdom applied to difficult circumstances, but tonight he had been reminded that the good life was not a distant goal, but a present possibility, available whenever we chose to see clearly what was already ours. Sunset and stargazing, embracing the universe. As evening approached, Seneca found himself drawn to the banks of the Tiber River, where the day's last light painted the water in shades of amber and rose. The city behind him hummed with its familiar sounds, voices calling across courtyards, the distant clatter of wheels on stone, the soft murmur of life continuing its ancient rhythms. He had walked here without conscious intention, his feet carrying him from the simple garden where wisdom had revealed itself in the sharing of bread, to this place where the river met the sky in perfect stillness. The water moved past him with unhurried grace, carrying with it the reflections of clouds, the scattered petals from flowering trees along the banks, the gentle debris of a day well lived. How many sunsets had he witnessed in his years? Yet tonight this one seemed to hold all the others within it. The elderly woman's words echoed softly in his memory, her quiet certainty that enough was always enough, that contentment was not a destination but a way of seeing. As the sun touched the horizon, he understood that he was watching the same celestial dance that had unfolded for countless generations, would unfold for countless more, each sunset both unique and eternal. The Stoics spoke of our place in the cosmic order, how we were each small threads in an immense tapestry, neither more nor less important than the stars beginning to emerge overhead. There was comfort in this perspective, relief in understanding that his worries, his ambitions, his carefully constructed plans were held within something so much larger than himself. The first stars appeared as the sky deepened, pinpricks of light that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach this moment, this place where he stood watching. He thought of all the nights he had spent in restless thinking, turning problems over in his mind like stones in his hands, believing that enough analysis could solve what only acceptance could release. Tonight felt different, softer somehow. The river continued its patient journey toward the sea, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow comforting in its constancy. The stars emerged more clearly now, constellations his tutors had taught him to name, patterns that sailors used to navigate vast oceans, the same lights that had guided travelers and dreamers since time began. He remembered his mother's garden in Cordoba, how she had taught him to notice the small miracles hidden in ordinary moments, the library where ancient voices had whispered their wisdom across centuries, the candlelit hours when he had discovered that writing was a form of prayer, a way of touching something eternal, the forum's chaos that had shown him the difference between motion and progress, the olive grove where he had learned that stillness was not emptiness, but fullness, the baths where his body had remembered how to release what it no longer needed to carry. All of it had led to this, standing beside the Tiber as darkness embraced the city, feeling himself part of something infinite and immediate. The Stoic teaching spoke of living according to nature, and here, now, he felt what that truly meant, not forcing life into patterns of his own design, but moving with the same grace as water, finding its way to the sea, as stars following their ancient paths across the heavens. A gentle breeze stirred the surface of the river, carrying with it the scent of night-blooming flowers, the coolness that promised rest. He thought of his bed waiting, his scrolls and letters, the work that would continue tomorrow. But these thoughts came without urgency, without the familiar tension of tasks undone. There would be time for all of it. Time measured not in achievements, but in moments of clear seeing. The city lights began to flicker on, small flames in windows where families gathered, where children were tucked into sleep with whispered stories, where lovers shared the day's joys and sorrows. Each light was a life, a universe of hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments. Yet from this distance, they seemed to form a constellation of their own, human stars reflecting the celestial ones above. He understood now what the philosophers meant when they spoke of the view from above, not a cold detachment from human concerns, but a loving perspective that held both the particular and the universal, the precious and the passing, the urgent and the eternal. His own worries had not disappeared, but they had found their proper proportion, like single notes in a vast symphony. The Tiber whispered its ancient song, the same melody it had sung for his ancestors, would sing for generations yet to come. There was peace in this continuity, in knowing that his small life was held within something so much larger, that his choices mattered precisely because they were part of this endless unfolding. As full darkness settled over Rome, Seneca felt himself releasing into the night like a prayer offered without words, his spirit expanding to meet the starlight, his breathing synchronizing with the river's flow, his heart opening to hold both the weight of human experience and the weightless wonder of being alive in this moment, under these stars, beside this water, part of the magnificent, mysterious, ever-changing, ever-constant dance of existence that asks nothing of us but presence and gives us everything in return.